Good morning. Robert Burns wrote a poem about a little mouse that his home was overturned by a plow. And in his poem it has this famous line, "The best laid plans of mice and men gang after glee," is what it actually says. Go often ugly or awry. And I always laugh because we make our plans and then we may do it and we may not. And up until last night, Greg planned to be here. And I haven't heard any blessed news, so there must not be a baby yet.
She just sent an update.
Oh, did she? What was the update?
Tara went to the hospital at 6:30, but baby still isn't engaging, so they started running.
Oh. So she's dragging this out. So keep Tara lifted up and those who are in there. I thought I'd take just a minute and talk about something that we all know fits this time of year, and that's Thanksgiving. And it's kind of interesting what's happened the last few years to a lot of American holidays, how they've become, in some people's minds, associated with bad things, and even Thanksgiving has fallen under this one, which, if you look historically, what the objection is, the history's not very good. Some First Nations, Native Americans are saying that Thanksgiving is a bad thing, but I think if you look at the first Thanksgiving, or at least what I choose to call the first Thanksgiving, and of course I'm right, it was in 1621, and this was after a very tough year at Plymouth, Massachusetts, now anyway, and it's another story altogether. But years before this, some British had come to our shores and had a raid, and they had taken a Native American, an Indian, back to England. And he stayed there for several years and learned the language, then wanted to go back, and he went back to live with his people. What just so happens, this fellow's name was Squanto, by the way, that the early Puritans, Pilgrims, were about starving because if you've ever noticed something, the ability to make a living is directly tied to your familiarity with the place. It's like those of us who've lived here in this country for a long time, we know how to farm this country, how to do things. But we were in North Carolina a few weeks ago, and if you came here from North Carolina and thought you were going to do the same things you did in North Carolina, you're in trouble. For one thing, there's no water. Any water you get, you've got to find it someplace. In North Carolina, they're trying to figure out what to do with all that water. And so the Pilgrims, they were starving to death. They didn't really know how to make a living. Well, Squanto came along, and I would love to have seen the look on their faces when they talked to him and he spoke back to them in English. But obviously the Lord had a plan. Squanto helped them. They learned how to plant in that country, what to plant, how to hunt. And so after a year, they decided to have a day of Thanksgiving. And one of the people that went to it, there were only 53 pilgrims that had survived at this point, and I think that's fewer than half, the ones that originally started. But his name was Edward Winslow, and he wrote this: "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling," in other words, hunting birds, "that so we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labor. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week." It's a lot of birds. "At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest, their greatest king, Massasoit," probably heard of him, "with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which we brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. And to me, that's just a good thing. That's just something to celebrate. Those who came here and faced all those staggering odds, I'm not sure I believe in coincidence. It's beyond miraculous that they find probably the one Indian on the continent who could speak English and knew that area, and it literally saved the lives of the colony. We talk a lot when we read our Bible about idioms, and a lot of people will read, especially their New Testament and the Old Testament, and they won't understand idioms. Idioms are very important because idioms never mean what they sound like. For instance, he has a swelled head. Do I mean he has a concussion? No, and the Dutch say it this way: he walks in front of his shoes. You know right off what that means, don't you? But it doesn't mean that he walks in front of it. And there are so many idioms. We use them all the time and we don't even think about it. Well, in the Bible, those speakers use idioms. And Yeshua, Jesus, when he talks, he'll speak in Hebrew idioms. One of these is the good eye and the bad eye in Matthew 6. And I've seen people talk about the good eye and they go off into transcendental meditation, which I guess that's okay, but that's not what he's talking about. The good eye is someone who gives, someone who is generous. The bad eye is someone who's stingy, grasping, avaricious, greedy, whatever word you want to use. And if you remember, Jesus said that if the eye is bad, the whole body is full of darkness. And one of the things we'll notice in our interactions with people is if someone is always trying to get, always trying to bring to themselves, they're not a very pleasant person to be around. In fact, they will soon find themselves kind of shunned. Who wants to be with you? And so when you think about being thankful is going outside yourself to acknowledge someone else. It's the act of admitting you're not the only person on the planet. In Acts 20, Paul quotes Yeshua, he quotes Jesus, and I tried to find this in the Gospels, so this, I don't think maybe it's there, but it certainly is in Acts. And he says, quoting Yeshua, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And that's an interesting statement because we have to receive. You've got to have food. You've got to have something to drink. You need clothes. You need a roof over your head. There are a whole bunch of things we call basic needs. You need to receive. But why would Jesus say it's more blessed to give than to receive? In Numbers 20, that might be worth turning there. You might just think as I'm going to Numbers 20, what makes us complain? What makes us grumble? What is going on when we grumble? And just to help you, where is my focus when I grumble? Well, it certainly is paying attention to the adversary, but who is my focus? Me. And Ron's right. When I focus on me, it's to the... But in Numbers 20, it talks about the whole Israelite community staying in the desert of Zin, where Miriam died. You know what? I might want 21. I do. 20 is a good story, but it's not the story I want. That's where they complained about water. 21 is where they complained about food. So if you start with verse 4 of Numbers 21, they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Now, think with me for a minute. Where do these statements come from? Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? Why are they in the desert?
Because he saved them from being in Egypt.
It's because they've escaped slavery, right?
Yeah, it's because slaves.
So lesson number 1. When your focus is on yourself, you may not always think the truth. I mean, if you were Moses, could this make you a little angry? Did Moses make them leave? No, they wanted to leave. I mean, slavery is not pleasant. But now it's, why did you take us out of Egypt? And then, there's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food. Who was giving them the manna? So who are they really mad at? Generally, when we grumble, that's who we're mad at. But we put religious whitewash on it so it doesn't look like it. Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. And if you read some of the Jewish sages, they'll tell you that the serpents were their words. And of course, I think in this case it probably is literally history and serpents bit them. But have you ever noticed that our words can go out from us and come back and bite us? That ever happened to you? You wish that never did, but it happens. And especially when we're grumbling and complaining, or like the Israelites also did here, putting the worst possible spin on a situation. The people came to Moses and they said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, he lived. That's an odd story. I mean, why would you look at a bronze snake? And why would that have any value at all? And yet, who quotes this passage and says, "As the snake was lifted up, I will be lifted up"? Jesus says this a couple places. John 3, I believe, and John 12. It's close, anyway. But, and I'm sure you've heard me say this before, I'm convinced that what the bronze snake is, to look up and see the bronze snake, is to acknowledge the provision of the Lord. And one of the things about a bronze snake that you might stop and think about, how many of you would rather be in a room with snakes that are crawling around or a room with a bronze snake? Anne says, neither one. But in those cultures, what did they do with an enemy that had been conquered, vanquished? I'll just ask you this, what happened to Goliath? They cut his head off and put it on a pole. Why? Why would you put Goliath's head on a pole? I mean, that's disgusting. It really is. How dangerous was Goliath with his head on a pole? He's not dangerous. And when we look at the serpent that's a bronze serpent, the defeated snake, we suddenly realize he has no strength. He can't destroy us. But and Ron said this when I talked about complaining. He said it's attention to the adversary. It's attention to Satan. If you don't believe that, go through a time in your life where you're grumbling and complaining and notice how the power of the enemy grows in your life. He can get you to do anything he wants. However, if you look to the Lord, if you're thankful, you'll notice that power goes away. There's an interesting Levitical writing that says this. It says, "Therefore, look to your Lord. Praise his name with a loud voice." And I often thought, what does that mean? Because it starts off by saying, "Now that my people may learn the way of their God, that they may be established in the Spirit, that they may," I think I got that out of order, "they may walk, that they may be established in the Spirit, that an awakening may come in them." Then it tells all these things that have happened. They've gone astray, they haven't listened to the prophets, the letter of the law knocks vainly at the door of their heart. So it says, therefore, look to your Lord. What does it mean to look to your Lord? I think we have the answer in Numbers 21. It's to look up and see that God has defeated Satan in our lives and to be thankful. But here's the thing that you know, and I'll just have to remind you. There's a reason that we have a day we set aside for Thanksgiving, because it needs to be intentional and planned. Anything that's natural, you don't need to plan it. You'll just do it. Those things that kind of are counter nature, if you don't get intentional, if you don't plan it. I mean, I know for me, I try to run a few days a week, usually about 3 days. If I don't plan it, I don't do it, because I don't get up in the morning and say, my goodness, I'd like to go run 3 miles. That is so wonderful. Well, generally, it's not. You feel better after you do it. And it's the same with anything. If you have made a habit in your life to get up and pray, to read your scripture, it's intentional, it's planned. And this is what's important about this Thanksgiving thing, and it's why it's great for our nation to have a day we've set aside to just say, we're grateful, we're thankful. We're thankful for what you've done, Lord, for the people in our lives, for the place you put us, for the church that you've established and founded us in. When you start to enumerate the things you're thankful for, you'll notice there are more things. If you're not intentional, thankfulness is not natural. You say, well, yeah, sometimes I feel thankful. And yes, you do. But you'll notice in Scripture it says that every one of us has the light of Jesus Christ in us, just as it says we have this nature. And there's this battle. 2 Corinthians 3, Paul talks about when the law is read, when the Torah is read, that a veil covers the face of the Jews. But he says whenever one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. We're no different. It's not just Jews. To turn to the Lord again is to be grateful, is to be thankful. And an interesting thing to me, in my Bible reading lately, I hit the book of Job. How many of you like the book of Job? That's one of the roughest books. I can't decide which is worse, Job or Ecclesiastes. Judges is a tough one. You know what I don't like about Judges? It just shows human nature just the way it is. But Job is a rough book because as people, we always have to know why something happened. And even when we don't, we still think we know. The whole book of Job, I can summarize it for you. You don't know, so stop it. What did Job's friends come to tell him? That this bad thing that had happened to him has to be a result of what? His sinfulness. He's done something wrong. And they know it. And they go on and quote the truth, that God blesses the righteous and He judges the wicked. And they say, thus, Job, we know you've done something bad. And Job says, no, I haven't. And he says, who can complain to God? Who can say a word to God? I was going through Job 28. And Job gets pretty eloquent in here. And I feel sorry for him because, and this is a good thing to remember, when someone's having a tough time, probably all they need you to do is show up, say nothing, and give them a hug. And if they're crying, go ahead and cry with them. Please don't try to figure out what the problem is. You're always going to be wrong. Unfailingly. I mean, these men came with Job, and Job was in such a terrible state, they didn't say a word for a week. They sat around with him, and they said nothing, which was perfect. But then they started to talk. Not perfect. And in the end, you know what happens? God comes, and He reproves those men, and Job has to make a sacrifice for them. And if you go read most of the stuff they read, we say, because it's true. Generally, the righteous are blessed, the wicked are judged. But in a situation, do you know? And anyway, Listen to some of what Job says in Job 28. There is a mine for silver and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth and copper is smelted from ore. Man puts an end to the darkness. He searches the furthest recesses for ore in the blackest darkness. Far from where people dwell, he cuts a shaft in places forgotten by the foot of man. Far from men, he dangles and sways. What's he talking about? Digging big tunnels into the earth, looking for, Job says, we know how to get stuff. We know how to get gold and copper. He goes on to say we can find jewels. He said, sometimes we go deep into the depths of the earth. Sometimes we go way across the desert to mountains, but we know how to find stuff. But he says, when it comes to wisdom, we don't know how to find it. He says, this is where man's hand assaults the flinty rock, lays bare the roots of the mountains. He tunnels through the rock. His eyes see all its treasures. He searches the sources of the rivers and brings hidden things to light. Man can do so much, but where can wisdom be found? And this man is saying this with his friends, assuring him that if he'll repent, everything will be fine. That one just brought me up so short when I thought about this being thankful. And one of the things I think God was telling me is, be thankful for who God is, not for what you wish He was, or not what you're afraid He is. Now, some people see such a negative view of God that if they only really knew who He was, it would change their whole outlook. Where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? Man does not comprehend its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. The deep says, it's not in me. The sea says, it's not with me. It cannot be bought with the finest gold. Job, I love how he makes this contrast. We go over land and sea and we find all this wonderful stuff, this neat stuff, this iron, gold, metal, jewels that we work with. But when it really comes to something important, it's not in the deep, it's not in the sea, it's not in the sky. And Job says, there's only one place, and that's God. And there's a great psalm, Psalm 115, that talks about making idols. And you know, as human beings, we do have a tendency to worship things that we've made or things that we love. It's just kind of natural with us. And often what we don't realize when we're worshiping something that is an idol or not God, usually it's us that we're worshiping. You know, this car that we wanted, this house, whatever it is, and cars and houses aren't bad. They're not good if you're worshiping them. But Psalm 115 says, we become like what we worship. So you know what? I often hear people say, well, Christians don't do that. Muslims do this. And I think, you know, that's kind of hard for you to say because every Muslim, every Christian, every Mormon, every house of Aaron, they're all different. Can you ever say, this group of people, you can't, because we're all individuals. It says this, those who make idols will become like them. And it's kind of I laugh as a vet, and of course it's not true in every case. But I have noticed that over time, a lot of time, people start ending up looking like their pets. I'll tell you, somebody put together about 50 pictures like that, and it was just hilarious. And we become like what we behold, what we look at. And so this whole concept of being thankful and looking to the Lord means that it will change us so we look like Him. Wouldn't that be wonderful if somebody ran into you after they were with you for a few weeks, months, years, who knows? They might forget your face, but they say, when I was with Doug, it was like being with Jesus. And I think that's the point here. I'll bring this to a close. We all know how important it is to be thankful. And I'll just bring something else out that I think you know. The Hebrew language helps us with some things. But todah, to be grateful, to give praise, comes from yadah, which means to cast or throw. Just like the word ahava, which is to love, comes from hev, which means to give. What you'll notice about both love and thanksgiving and praise in Hebrew is that they're giving. They're coming. Have you noticed sometimes in English, love is about getting? But we all know anybody that reads their Bible knows that's not what love is. Love is giving. And when we love, we receive. Being thankful is intentional. It's directed, it's not automatic. And so there's a song that we all sing, and I'll bet everybody here knows it. And it's Count Your Many Blessings. What's the next line? Name them one by one. I sometimes forget to do that. Why is it important to name your blessings? Because it reminds you. You know, if someone gets up here and says, I thank the Lord for this beautiful day, some of us will go, well, so what? It's a beautiful day. It makes a huge difference in how you see life when you realize that God has blessed you with a good day. That you could get up. You know, Greg came to me late last night saying, Lois and I need to go, Tara's in labor, and I said, great, go, fine, we'll cover it. Then I came in here this morning and I talked to Ron briefly, and we weren't ready for church because somebody else had it all under control. And I was back there packing all this stuff around thinking, man, I'm too old to do this. And I was joking with myself, and suddenly I heard just the Lord clear as a bell say, aren't you grateful that you can? And I was suddenly just covered with joy and gratitude. I can. I'm able to. And I thought, what a blessing. Count your blessings. It makes life, to count your blessings is to remember that you have a loving God who created you, who has a purpose for your life, and He will not stop finishing His work in you. Joy, did you tell Sharon the verse?
No.
Well, she gave her kids a verse.
I gave the kids a verse last week, but I can't remember it.
That's helpful.
So tell me what it is. Psalm 8.
Okay, kids, let's come up. We'll do the verse. While Sharon is finding the verse that, I think that's funny that Joy gave them the verse, and luckily they remember what it is.
I know, I had to remind him.
Good job. Do you guys remember the verse? You do? Okay, it's Psalm 8:1. Why don't you say the verse for them?
O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your word above the heavens.
Very good. So,
Repeat the verse, please.
Psalm 8, verse 1. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Very good. You can go to your classes.